Hello, I'm Daniel Franklin, Executive and Diplomatic Editor at The Economist, and welcome to this discussion on unlocking digital values, a path to recovery and beyond. Many thanks to Huawei for generously supporting this Insight Hour. Just a few housekeeping points to begin with before I introduce our panelists. It's best to use Google Chrome to view this webinar. You'll find full biographies of our panelists to the right of your screen, and you'll also find a box with a selection of further readings on this topic. Please do download that to enrich the background information you have, and you'll also find a Q&A box should you have any questions for our panelists. Now, to our panelists, I'm delighted that we're joined by Taavi Rõivas, former Prime Minister of Estonia, Jacqueline de Rojas, President of techUK, and Andrew Williamson, Vice President and Economics Advisor at Huawei Technologies. I should just say that Dambisa Moyo, who was meant to be with us today, had a last-minute emergency and sadly isn't able to attend and sends her apologies. So our topic is unlocking digital values, a path to recovery and beyond. We've had a very intense experience from the pandemic, from the lockdowns, from the disruption to our normal working lives. So I hope that we're going to draw lessons from that experience. What are the big challenges and problems and also the opportunities that have been revealed by this? There's clearly been a great acceleration of a shift to dependence on digital technologies. I think we will also explore the role of governments, the role of the private sector, and where each of these actors has key policies to introduce and key adjustments to make. And I think we're also going to want to look at how you unlock or unleash value while also avoiding unlocking inequality and perhaps even instability. So that's the sort of framework for the next hour. And perhaps we could start with you, Taavi, in your experience in Estonia. It would be helpful, I think, to describe a little bit what Estonia has done in really setting a digital infrastructure for government, which has been really pioneering, and you as Prime Minister and beyond have been very involved in that. So tell me, clearly a small country, it's perhaps a little bit easier than it might be in a much bigger country, but you have really empowered citizens and connected citizens digitally in a way that few other countries have done. Tell us how that's worked.
Well, thank you for this very kind introduction. Well, the most important thing to share is that in Estonia, all the public services can happen and mostly do happen without the citizen going to any public office. So we offer the public services remotely across the internet. Just, if you want to register your address, or if you want to check if anybody is eligible to sign on behalf of this is all in electronic registers, and everybody can check without passing any physical paper documents or visiting any public office. Now, in order to have that possible, we introduced the digital ID already 18 years ago. This is like electronic version of your passport that works as one physical part, be it your SIM card that has this additional functionality, and one, so to say, digital part, which is usually a PIN code. And this together creates a very safe authentication solution. So long story short, with or without COVID, Estonians get all their public services from their homes or from their offices. They don't go to any public offices. Much because we are small, but this is mainly because we started, or rather restarted, our government and our system, if we can call it this way, around 30 years ago when we got our freedom back from the occupation of Soviet Union. And when starting something from scratch 30 years ago, it was exactly the right time to start from the beginning digitally, not going there with this red tape and lots of paper bureaucracy. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Probably quite a few questions follow from that, but what sort of issues have you faced in doing that? I mean, one immediate question, we'll come on to the advantages of it in a second, but one immediate question is the security of this. And Estonia has been the victim of some quite sophisticated hacking or cyber attacks over the period that you mentioned. Have there been issues of security? Are citizens confident that this can all happen in a secure way?
Absolutely. It's actually much more secure than keeping any valuable data on paper. In private sector, this is done digitally for quite long already. If you think about, let's say, very sensitive topic like banking, there is no in UK or anywhere else in big countries that keeps the logs, how much money everybody has on paper. This is all in digital system, and we trust our money to be registered, the amount we have, the transactions we have had, all is digital. If this fails, there is no paper proving that I had 100,000 pounds in this or that British. Same way, Estonian government has introduced different and not in one location, but in different locations, in different systems, like similar information bases, basically like the banks have. So yeah, I would say it's much more safe than having documents on paper, and also it's much more secure because verifying your identity with your gas, not the most secure way to do it in 21st century, and signing something with just a scribble, I think it's ridiculously unsafe. In Estonia, we sign documents with digital stamp that has a highest level encryption. So if you think which is easier to falsify, scribble that reminds your name or might not remind your name, or the latest encryption on it. I think there is nobody that says that the scribble is more safe.
And so just to come on to Jacqueline in a moment, but I want to ask you also, what challenges have you had, and what over the experience of these past 18 or so years, what lessons from the issues that you've had to overcome in implementing this would you draw out and say that to other governments who may be considering such a system, they should bear in mind?
Mm-hmm. The biggest questions have been around security and privacy. So the system has to be designed this way that the citizen knows what happens with the data. Otherwise, the citizens are suspicious. Actually, Estonian government doesn't have any more information than any other government in the world about their citizens. But as it is digital, it's always people thinking that, we don't know what to do with that. Now, in order to prevent that, most of the critical systems in Estonia have proper logs. So, for example, my health data is fully digital. It's in a central system, so any doctor can have a look at my health data. If I haven't closed it specifically, I need to close some parts of my health data in order to not them to see that. But if they see it without my permission, I can. So in a way, even if my dentist is looking at my knee injury information, that's a violation, and there is a log that I as a patient see myself, I can just log in right now with my iPhone and see who has looked at my health data during the last year or so. And if there is any doctor who has looked at I haven't authorized to do so, I can in principle press charges. So I think the biggest concern are always security, like both the system needs to be secure and also how the data privacy is handled, because rightfully so, people want to know what actually happens with their data.
So, Jacqueline, if I could turn to you now, your organisation, specifically UK Association, listening to that, how far along the line do you think the UK is in this, and what lessons would you draw from a country that's had such a comprehensive system as Estonia has had?
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting listening to Taavi there. I would just say that there are a couple of assumptions in it, which is that they have an agreed standard of establishing credentials online. We are nowhere close to that. In fact, I think as a country, we rejected it roundly, possibly because of the way the story landed. But establishing credentials online as a standard for everybody is firstly a grounding principle. Secondly, broadband infrastructure for the entire country, hashtag not just cities, is a must in order to get it done. So that's regional inclusion is very important. And also the assumption that everyone has access to tech. Not everyone has access to tech in the UK. I think there's 12.5% of the population do not. And on top of that, 1 in 7 registered disabled, so the inability to use the tech, even if they have it. There's lots of differences, I think, between the UK and Estonia. The one area where we are catching up, of course, because of the pandemic, is that adoption has been super fast over the last few months. So, the countries that thrive in a digital society are the ones that adopt very quickly a digital option. And so that is helping us to catch up. But we do have to make sure we don't leave anybody behind because of underlying assumptions that everyone has access to tech, and we have an agreed standard on digital identity, because we don't.
And so how do you sort out, if you like, or address that last 10% or whatever it is of people who aren't connected in a world which is depending more on digital anyway? Because even if you don't go as far as Estonia has gone and make all services digitized in this way, connectivity is absolutely crucial in all sorts of other areas for economic opportunity. And we see that now, that if you can't connect in the way that we're doing now, for example, many jobs simply aren't going to be possible.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic will have amplified areas where we have had to work harder anyway. So businesses that weren't doing well before are definitely not doing well now. If you're not digital, you're simply not in the game. So, for example, let me give you a great example. Amazon, Jeff Bezos, made $28 billion in June of this year, owns the high street. There are other companies, British, clothing businesses, for example, who've got no online presence, made precisely zero, having made 9 billion last year, for example. So if you're not digital, you're not in the game. That is certainly a change in the landscape. We have to then think about how we design our technology so that we don't leave anybody behind. And we have to also make sure that we roll out broadband, as you say, to every corner of the geographical country borders. Otherwise, we will be in danger of creating for just the large cities and also solving for just the large companies. And in the UK, 66% of all jobs come from SMEs, and we have to be careful about that.
And where do you think the responsibility for that lies principally? Is it mainly government, or is it private sector as well?
I think the best outcomes come where industry and government work together. And so I would like to see that public-private partnership work harder and faster with a more precise imperative, creating broadband as a utility, as an example, and making sure that we have that access for everybody, but also that, whilst we do that, we make sure that we've got the education in place for those that aren't yet digital savvy to make sure that they can take advantage of the new digital future.
Yeah. Andrew, if I could bring you in now, your company obviously involved in setting this sort of, or helping this infrastructure take place, but it's a very mixed picture around the world, also a very contested picture around the world these days. If you sort of take a quick tour of the world, how would you see that picture now? Is it very patchy?
Oh, without doubt. We've conducted research. ITU has done likewise, and there's a very strong correlation, it seems, with latest economic forecasts in terms of the strength of those going into 2021 and the level of sophistication of connectivity and digital ecosystems of countries. And I think on Jacqueline's point, if you look around the world, actually what we've seen is that the flexibility and agility of digital solutions has really been critical during this pandemic. And I think it's been noted by the likes of Microsoft, other big tech companies, that they've taken their customers through 2-3 months of digital transformation that they would have expected previously to take about 5 years. So there's been a real acceleration, I think, in terms of digitalization of companies. And of course, the foundation of that is digital infrastructure. So it seems even more crucial than ever that we build out across all countries as much as we can much better digital infrastructure. I think Bill Gates remarked, actually, in an interview with The Economist, he talked about how remarkable it was that we had essentially built digital infrastructure that allowed us to go and watch Netflix at home when we got home from work. And that kind of 5 megabits per second had provided the foundation for us to actually work from home during the lockdowns and the need for social distancing. It allowed us to buy goods and services online and get them delivered, and also the continuation of our children's education. So really, I think if anything, that the crisis has shown the real critical need for build out and acceleration of digital infrastructure.
So where are the gaps? I mean, Jacqueline talked about this in the UK context, obviously, but the 12% or so of people who are not connected. If you look at the not just those who are not connected, but those who need faster connections, the huge, presumably huge growth in demand that lies ahead as we depend more and more on digital services. What do you see as the crunch points coming up?
The crunch points really in the advanced economies is this, continuous issue about, rural connectivity. Okay, so where the private costs of setting up infrastructure is seen as too much by the private sector. So, but there's ample evidence to suggest that the social benefits of doing so far outweigh those private costs. So those are ongoing issues. We know that. We really recognise the need for a build out of high megabits download capability. We're talking about gigabit capability now across a lot of Europe. So the cost of fibre to the home, fibre to the premises is still very prohibitive in some countries. 5G is clearly the backup or rival solution to that. So that's the ongoing issues about closing the digital divide. But there's a much more pressing need, obviously, in the developing world in terms of how they advance and make sure they don't fall even further behind in terms of the obvious growth opportunities in the digital economy going forward. So there's a number of solutions that the industry is looking at to assist with those kind of issues and challenges.
Well, let's look at some of these sort of divides that need to be addressed to unlock value, I suppose, for everyone, not just those who already have the ability to be connected. Taavi, how have you tackled this? Because I did refer to Estonia as a small country, but it's not a completely uniform country, and it will have its pockets of less connected, and you've presumably had to deal with precisely the sorts of issues that Jacqueline's been talking about, of those who are not connected. Do you have solutions that you, from your experience, that you can share?
Well, first of all, there are, of course, also in Estonia, people who don't use computers, and there needs to be at least still so far some sort of solution for them, either with having the backup of getting the service also the municipality or public office, but the amount of those people who don't have any digital access is actually decreasing very rapidly, and this is not so much because governments, but it is precisely about the topic that Andrew was mentioning, connectivity in terms of so far it's mostly 4G still, but in soon 5G and also fiber, but also it is thanks to using smartphones. Many people in the world, including my grandfather, by the way, who's 84, has never owned a PC. He has never known how to operate a PC, whereas he has had all the latest and greatest phones, and he can use it very easily because it's so much more intuitive for him. And also, if I look at my kids, my youngest is not even 1.5 years old, and she is also already like using the basic things that she needs to use on her iPad. So I think thanks to technology developing, thanks to connectivity getting better and better, the digital divide will get smaller and smaller, and I'm very much with Jacqueline that of course we need to address that as well. But so like if we have even one person who cannot access any computer, then we need to have some sort of physical backup. But the same is with banks. I mean, most of the people are using internet banking for quite some time already, but there are still some bank offices. Simply there are less bank offices, and they don't need to be as big because nobody really goes there. At least in Estonia, like the number of bank offices is much more, and the cost also to maintain them, so they can invest in other aspects. And the same applies basically to public offices. So the money that we can save from having public offices open as like physical office to visit as a citizen, we can invest this to development and do something greater.
So you paint a rather encouraging picture of a sort of diminishing set of problems because of more people connected, more intuitive technology. Can I put it to you, perhaps, Jacqueline, you could have a go at this, that there is another set of problems or issues that may be growing as we digitize more and more, and that's because of the role of the algorithm. And what goes on in the background is, in many cases, a sort of mystery to the user, but we're being directed to things through algorithms, and those algorithms sort of have a mind of their own and are sometimes, well, they're certainly only as good as the data that you feed into them, and sometimes that the data that you feed in is itself based on a rather biased, if you like, view of the world, or partial cross-section of society. So you may be building in a sort of tilted view of who gets the opportunities through the algorithms that digital technology depends on. So I suppose the question to you is that a problem? And if it is, what do you do about it?
It certainly is a problem. Even without technology, we live in a world of privilege and bias, which we need to be able to see past if we're going to digitize it. So, when the seatbelt was invented, women and children died simply because the seatbelt was invented by men of a certain weight and height. So, you start from there and you go to police stab vests in the UK are still built for humans without breasts. And we could go on. And the moment you start to digitize all of those things is the moment you get to the state that you're talking about, Daniel, which is, if an algorithm now decides whether you get that job interview, that loan, access to a place at university, then we have to make sure that these algorithms are built by diverse teams that reflect all of our voices and all of our community, because otherwise there is no other way to police that. If you start putting governance in, the governance itself could be biased or skewed or from a certain socioeconomic position. So diverse voices, I think AI guru Dame Wendy Hall said, if it's not diverse, it's simply not ethical in relation to building algorithms. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is that, transparency is super important. So algorithms should not be built as a black box. And we need to be able to see how algorithms are built so that we can understand the instructions that humans have given them when they've been built. And then to your final point about data, data and clean data lakes are super important as a currency of the future, because it is those data lakes that will define and decide how algorithms and machine learning starts to educate itself. And that's where you get exponential changes in outcomes that you probably would class today as massive unintended consequences. And we already see it on trading floors of the stock market, where we have to stop a rogue algorithm going off and doing some bad trades. So yeah, we have to worry about all of that. But I think diversity is the answer to most of those questions.
So I would expect a sort of industry group like yours, or an association like yours, to be out in front of that, to be very aware of it, to be pushing for it. But as far as you can tell, do you think the public is getting more engaged in this? Do you think there's a bigger, broader pressure pushing in this direction?
I think there is, because we're interfacing with more pieces of software. When we talk to customer service centres these days, you think you're talking to a human, you're actually talking to a chatbot, and you can tell after a few questions that you're not actually being answered by a human. And actually, they are pretty good. They are very, very good. That and that's great. RPA, robotics, and process automation. But we also then need to make sure that there is insight into the answers that they are giving. So I'll give you a great example. Last night I got a response from travel insurance saying, this is the outcome from your travel claim. And I went back and said, well, hold on a minute. I don't understand how you have calculated this. A human would have probably given me that conversational piece, but I wasn't given that. And I think it's a great example of the public will now start to demand insight, because the computer says no is no longer going to be good enough, especially for those companies wanting to create competitive advantage whilst they're using and leveraging automation.
And Andrew, is this something that you, from the tech company point of view, that you're mindful of, experiencing pressure for? How does it seem to you?
Yes, well, I'm a bit more optimistic about these things. I think there is a great recognition around these issues. I think actually the EU is really kind of at the forefront of solutions. So we think of, policies that are already being put in place, such as the GDPR. But the EU released its white paper on artificial intelligence back in February. It had this kind of checklist for all companies, essentially, but especially technology companies to go through. See how they score, where the obvious gaps are in terms of what they're doing. And, Huawei has done and been actively involved in this process in Europe. So, we've really taken a very rigorous look at this. Even to date, there's only, not all technology companies have really come out and talked about their principles for artificial intelligence. But we are, very close to publishing that, and we are, again, this is all very new technology. It's all nascent, and it's difficult to think through, how this will really impact on our economies and our societies over the next 5-10 years. But it will be impactful. So it's kind of grouping around certain thematic categories, pillars. We're trying to put rules in place about human AI collaboration. There's always kind of oversight by humans. Humans should always supersede these decisions. Issues surrounding safety and robustness, security and privacy, of course, traceability and accountability, diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. But there's a lot to do. I know of a kind of a anecdotal story. It wasn't in our company, but I think it's a really interesting one about AI. So it's being used a lot, many of us know, in terms of recruitment in HR. And it was being used in a technology company, who I won't name, but it's not Huawei. And effectively, it was obviously having a bias towards male applicants. So they scrubbed the data, they anonymized it in terms of gender, but then it was picking up the machine learning kind of, hobbies like computer gaming or, American football, things that perhaps, were more popular with men. So the machine learning was learning to kind of be biased by other data sets. And these things are often very hard to pick up a priori. So I think we're all going on this journey, but I think, the industry, many other stakeholders recognize the problems and issues.
Jacqueline, you're nodding at that. I mean, it's a sort of quite a hard thing to tackle, isn't it? Because it's so built into, as you say, it's hard programming in or hard wiring in, softwaring in, perhaps, I don't know what the expression would be, pre-existing prejudices. And that's the danger. You reinforce what's already there rather than trying to do something about it.
Yeah, and we have to just challenge ourselves always. And maybe it's not just a single check, it's a double check, it's a triple check on just what lens are you looking at this through? How do we make sure that the software learns to check itself actually as well? And I am totally optimistic that we will have a thriving digital ethics community. And I look at the bodies in the UK as well as the ones that Andrea mentioned, but we've got the Government Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, we've got the Nuffield Foundation, the Ada Lovelace Institute. All of these people, they wake up every morning and worry about all of these things. And we as an industry have to make sure that we are at the vanguard of that and making sure that the things that we are building are built by diverse teams so that we create a future that includes everybody and doesn't isolate the few on the fringes.
What I'd like to do now is turn to really the experience of this year. First of all, some of the lessons that have been learned through this very intense kind of case study that we've all been going through, and then perhaps look at some of the turning ahead to the sort of brighter opportunities that more rapid adoption of digital technologies represent, and then perhaps also looking at some of the dark side of this and the things that we have to be aware of or be wary of in that process. So let's look at the lessons first of all. I'd like to go around this virtual table and ask you all for one or two of the main lessons that you've drawn, and also that perhaps policymakers and corporate leaders ought to be mindful of through this extraordinary period we've been in. So Taavi, let's start with you. What do you think springs out from a year of extraordinary reliance and acceleration of the digital world? Well,
as an optimist, let me just pick some very positive trends. For example, could be not meet at a conference with you, and in a way, of course, I would prefer doing that. But on the other side, having this technology of video conferencing going so viral as it has gone, it has actually made the world a smaller place in a way, so that we can talk to China, to UK, to Estonia, while everybody is actually at their own offices, and we can do this call right now, and in 1 hour we can talk to 3 other countries. So doing business, interacting with friends, this has become in a way also much easier. If I need to pick only one sector where I think this COVID made us innovate and made us think differently is education. My daughter, who goes to 5th grade, had to stay at home to study from home. They had all sorts of digital tools to do that. Estonia wasn't completely ready for that because we hadn't practiced that before to this extent. And now it is like a new normality that can function very well. And this gives me a chance to take separate courses from, let's say, Oxford or MIT. By the way, I took during this pandemic, I took a course at artificial intelligence, the topic that you were talking so interestingly about. And this, again, like, it gives me, who I am far from London, an opportunity to study at UK universities. I think it's a good thing.
Great. Andrew, from far as you're concerned, I mean, clearly this period has coincided with your company being thrust into the geopolitical spotlight. You're right in the heart and the heat of great power rivalry. What lessons do you draw from this past year?
Well, the lessons, I mean, I think I touched upon it earlier. We've witnessed, the data really shows that there's been these trends were ongoing in terms of digital adoption and digitalization. They've been greatly accelerated in 2020 across many businesses. That's not to say that all internet companies have done well. Clearly those companies like Airbnb or Uber have suffered much more than others. But by and large, there has been this great acceleration. I think UK is a really good case in point. It was a world leader in terms of e-retail as a proportion of overall retail sales. I think it was something like 20%. It's been measured, kind of through spring and into summer, that it's let unbelievably up to around 35%. So, obviously once the pandemic is over, we'll go back to some sort of normality and some recognition of how things were before. But a lot of people are calling it the new normal. And I think, a lot of these changes are here to stay. And I would also say it's been, it's a bit counterintuitive, but there has been great business creation and a lot of innovation. Stunningly in China about new ways of doing things. There's a company called WeDoctor, for example, that's part of Tencent. They offered free medical consultations online, and they have increased their subscriber base 36 times, explosive growth. People couldn't visit properties in China, obviously during the lockdown and afterwards. With social distancing. So you've had this real takeoff through real estate agents of virtual reality. You can visit properties and do it that way. And again, these types of companies that have adopted to digitalization have done extremely well. So, I think there's other examples that are coming through. Etihad is now really trialing kind of digital health checks, distancing at airports, partnering with technology companies. So that's been a real lesson of this year, is this acceleration in trends in digitalization and this great leap in innovation.
Yeah, you're in Shenzhen, and life in China has gone back more to normal than in many other parts of the world. So I think how much of these changes are sticking when people are no longer worrying so much about pandemic? That's going to be a critical question right around the world. How much of this is one-off adjustment and how much is here to stay, do you think, from what you have observed?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of this is here to stay, okay? It's really quite remarkable, the kind of, especially on the e-retail. I mean, China is already very advanced. We know that from the likes of Alibaba. But I think, a real difference has been the way that during the pandemic and the aftermath, there really wasn't that much travel that was happening. So lots of rural areas that depended on tourists to come and buy kind of local produce, they suffered. So, and in Hubei province, there was a reluctance to buy anything from that province and from Wuhan. So actually, the big retailers and the internet companies rallied round, and they held these kind of big festivals online to showcase, delicious peaches from Hubei province. And, as a nation, people rallied round and started ordering these types of local goods and produce, and that's being maintained. So I think a lot of things that have happened out of necessity look set to change. And just to go back, on what Taavi was also talking about with the older generation, I think as well, there's lots of evidence to suggest an unintended consequence of the pandemic has actually been the adoption of digital solutions and tools. For the first time, people had to use these tools. They had to start video streaming with their grandchildren or their children. They had to start buying online. So we've seen, surveys and evidence to suggest that the silver surfers, as they're called, have, really greatly expanded. So, a good unintended consequence has been the kind of improvement in digital awareness and digital skills of a demographic, a group of people that had been previously quite hard to reach.
Jacqueline, if you could pick up your lessons from this year, and also lessons for government, for policymakers, because it hasn't, clearly we've seen in the UK on the tech front, it hasn't all been plain sailing, has it?
No, it hasn't, but I enjoyed listening to both Taavi and Andrew. I certainly think education, the reach of education has just been phenomenal. We've all had a bit more time, and so we've been able to go anywhere. So I totally get that. I see shifts that will stay. I certainly cannot see myself going to a doctor's surgery for something I can have a 5-minute consultation on via video call, which will certainly change, because flexible working has meant that we drive less and we drive more for efficiency. And I think that's definitely something that will happen. As I sit on my various boards, and Rightmove is one of them, property portal, and it's so interesting where, as a board member, lots of conversation around, we ought to do this for digital transformation, we ought to make this investment. Now, digital transformation is right up there, number 1, number 2, and number 3, in terms of what do we need to do. And I think the investments are much more focused and urgent, which was not the case before. I would say, to answer the question around government, there are some things that we are pushing for with the UK government, and that is that it's always easier, Taavi will probably recognise this, it's always easier to solve for the larger companies and not the smaller ones. And so one of the things that we're pushing for is, it sounds quite mundane actually, but it's tax credits for OPEX, not just CAPEX, when it comes to technology spend. And that means that our smaller and medium businesses can spend their tax-efficient money on cloud services and not have to become technologists themselves. We still have 25% of businesses in the UK who do not have a website. So we have to be very mindful of the fact that we've got to encourage much more digital adoption. That may have changed since March, by the way, but it is very interesting how we must continue to push government on policy like this to encourage smaller businesses. And as I said before, 66% of all jobs in this country come from small businesses. We are a nation of corner shops, and we do have to make sure we look after that sector.
There's perhaps this links into that. There's a question from the audience on the UK tech sector. It's sustained a series of punches on privacy, COVID, Huawei 5G replacement. These are self-inflicted wounds. This person says, how can we overcome them and avoid others? So I suppose, how can we get better at this policy-making business on tech in UK?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to have more tech people in government. Because from that perspective, you'll have more people who understand the problem, and I think that's half the battle. I think the other thing is to start to remove some barriers, like we're talking about broadband and rolling that out, but we don't make it easy, even from a planning perspective. How do you get a new mast installed? We have lots of barriers in the way where we need to make that kind of infrastructure and construction build easier. We need to incentivise that new take-up of gigabit broadband, educate people that they can trust it, and I think work to close the digital divide that has been opening up between rural communities and with cities.
Thank you. Now, I said I wanted to look at both the bright side and the dark side of in the future. Let's start with the bright side and perhaps the green side. Actually, there's a lot of talk about how digital technologies can really play a substantial role in reducing carbon emissions, moving towards an economy that is much less polluting and much less intensive in the sorts of harmful substances that contribute to global warming. How to make that opportunity really happen? And Taavi, perhaps you could talk about your country and how you think that might be part of the economic policy framework in the coming years to push things in that direction if it doesn't happen organically.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in order to push changes forward, there is a need for political leadership, obviously, and I think it's very positive that there is serious political commitment, I would say, almost globally, or I think it's correct to say globally, in tackling or addressing climate change and making the economy and the world less consuming, let's put it this way, in terms of or less polluting. I think also a lot of those things that take things digital actually address the same concerns, and they are helping us to make world a better place, also climate-wise. Be it simple things as having less things on paper, or be it more serious things like autonomous vehicles driving on hydrogen or electricity. I mean, there's a number of things that can address that.
Andrew, from your perspective, is this something that you're pushing for governments to help adopt with the help of digital infrastructure?
Oh, for sure. I mean, on in many different dimensions. You know, we think we're great advocates for this idea of a digitally driven and green economic recovery. They really go hand in hand. There's many examples of that. You know, for example, in the developing world, when we're thinking about building out smart grids, digital technologies are really absolutely vital in terms of, you know, managing different power supplies. We provide, in partnership with many other companies, kind of solutions for that. It's quite extraordinary how digital capabilities for measurement can be really insightful in terms of managing your electricity grid. Build out of national power grids as well are going hand in hand with fiber rollout. So as the developing world is kind of building out their smart, hopefully green grids, you run through the cabling, the fiber that you need for that. We have a solution we're very proud of called Rural Star. And this is our attempt to bridge the real digital divide that still exists. Something like 700 million people around the world still have no connectivity, even to 2G, can't use mobile phones. So Rural Star doesn't look very pretty, but it's a base station and an antennae system. It runs off of solar power. You know, previously, these things used very dirty diesel generators, so it's completely solar powered. And it's really profound. It's the impacts that these kind of, you know, these rollout of rural mobile infrastructure connectivity has on these villages that previously had no connectivity at all. So it's not just in terms of, you know, environmental impacts. They can have information from governments to help them in terms of lowering their environmental impact, but it has really profound impacts. We've done a case study with GSMA that talks about a village in Kenya called Dusa, and it just talks about how security was improved. Security flows into healthcare because doctors, nurses are more willing to go and stay in these villages. The healthcare improves. Children start going to school more often. You know, it just has this virtuous uplift and cycles. So, maybe one of the opportunities of this year and this pandemic is for governments and many stakeholders to really think about, how we digitalize and green our existing and future infrastructure.
And Jacqueline, isn't there a little bit of a danger that this becomes the mantra for everybody, and it sounds almost too good to be true in many ways? But do you think it's really as much of an opportunity as is made out?
I think so. I mean, I think if only from a conscience perspective, we're the first generation to know we're destroying the planet and the last one that can do anything about it. So, there is that conscience piece. But I think the other part of that is that I think companies will start to be measured on their contribution to society as much as their contribution to profit in the stock market. Because, the pandemic has done a lot of things, but it's also created something else, which is much more of a community spirit, a local conscience support mechanism. The lowest paid workers in our society have now become the most important key workers, cleaners and nurses. And hopefully we will start to behave differently around how communities matter, how companies are judged. And I think companies will now be also judged on their social value and how they perform in terms of climate, as much as they are on their, all of their other socioeconomic contributions. And I think that's really, really important to remember. It will also be, I think, the next generation will think about who they want to work for based on the purpose and generosity of a company's vision and mission. So I personally think that will be very important as we go forward. And digital has a big part to play in that, because we're also seeing that flexible working, for example, has enabled us to work from anywhere. Efficiency is the altar at which we all, worship at. And now we need to make sure that we harness that efficiency, and we also pay it back through doing the right thing for our climate and our local community as well.
Well, we've just got a few minutes left, and I apologise for focusing on the dark side in these last few minutes, but I think we have to go there because there are worries about. I mean, we haven't skirted worries about the making sure everybody is engaged and has the opportunities, but there are also worries about privacy. There are worries about misuse of data, worries about artificial intelligence going off with almost a mind of its own, worries about state snooping. And Andrew, how worried should we be about that? And people are very worried about China, for example, and your company is a Chinese company, and people worry about its connections to the Chinese state.
For sure, as I mentioned previously, there is an opportunity here, but, as with all kind of technologies of the past, the technology itself is benign. It's the humans, they're essentially the problem and how they're used. But this is not a time for division. This is really a time for cooperation. There are, as I mentioned, there are many initiatives that are out there to try and allay these concerns. There was the Paris call from President Macron, talking about the need for the governments of the world to come together and really kind of lay down the rules, the framework for cybersecurity and national cybersecurity at that. And there has been some uptake, but there's lots more that can be done. I mentioned, there are the efforts within the European Union to set a global standard, as it's done with GDPR, on data and data privacy in terms of, setting down the ground rules for artificial intelligence as well. So, the other aspect of this, of course, as well, is that if we're going to spend money wisely, taxpayers' money wisely as well, this is not a time to restrict markets. The 5G equipment market is actually, there's only really 5 major players in the world. And certainly, Huawei is really at the forefront in terms of technical capability and quality for money. This is not the time to really, close down competition, because we know that competition, closed competition, restricting companies increases prices. It's going to delay rollout. This has been admitted even by, UK government and others. It's going to greatly delay the rollout of 5G, a really fundamental technology, at really the worst time to be doing that. So, there are lots of ways that there are lots of problems and challenges that we need to resolve, but they're not going to be solved by standoffs.
But that's where we are, isn't it? I mean, that in a way that battle's been lost, hasn't it? We're in a situation where the barriers are coming down, and what are going to be the consequences? Are we going to see a divided world, do you think, in technological terms? So,
well, you will know, Daniel, it's very hard to forecast the future. There are many things that happen to change. I hope not. We'll see. Next year. Certainly within the industry, there is no. Many relationships have been built up between Chinese companies, American companies, others over decades in terms of the tech sector. This has all been very unfortunate. There is no push to have this bifurcation and different technology spheres of influence around the world, in kind of North America, Europe, Asia. Nobody wants that at all. So, we are looking to the politicians to perhaps see sense, and we hope reason will prevail.
Okay, and Taavi, if I could turn to you on this. I mean, you've been, I guess your focus naturally in Estonia when it comes to the dark side is more towards Russia, and you have very tangibly felt Russia's attention, I think, on the tech front. So how do you tackle that in future, and how do you prepare for that or minimize the risks, I suppose?
Well, there is no country probably that hasn't felt Russian attention. U.S. cyber cases are much more recent than the Estonian ones. But in the case of designing the digital world, of course, you need to take care of cybersecurity as basic hygiene. I mean, it goes without saying. You cannot do anything without that. But just to contradict just slightly, I think gathering data on certain issues while treated properly, as I agree with Andrew, that this is very much people behind that, how we design and how we use that data. In many ways, it can be used for our own benefit. As a politician, I see a number of ways how to use data in order to do or take smarter decisions. We know from mobile data, anonymized, of course, how people are moving, so we can plan better cities or plan it better. Or for example, if elderly people in one or another city don't buy, for some reason, generic drugs, you can run a campaign or to educate them and say that generic drugs are equally safe. There are any number of cases where, with use of data in an anonymized and systemized way, you can take much better decisions and you can serve citizens much better.
Jacqueline, last word to you on this dark side. How dark is it?
Well, I'm a technology optimist, and I think the advantages of tech far outweigh the disadvantages. However, I am going to say that there is a responsibility of government and businesses to create a secure environment for us to operate in. But I am also going to say that it is our responsibility as citizens also, to not be too cavalier about what we put out there as well. If you're not paying for something online, then you're probably the product. And I think you just have to think about what you're putting out there. And I think there is a personal responsibility to secure your own credentials online as well, to be responsible about that. And also for, our young people, our little people, to be able to learn how to stay safe online when they're tiny. So they need to grow up with that. We are, I think, more cavalier than we should be with data out there. I think we have a personal responsibility, but I think that should be working hand in hand with businesses and government as well.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time, but I think you've very helpfully at the end there brought in perhaps the final missing piece of the puzzle. We talked about the roles of governments, we talked about the roles of private companies, you've just talked about the roles of individuals. I think overall we've had actually a very complete, broad picture of the whole complex of issues that have cropped up. On the whole, I take it there's an optimism out there, but I think we haven't skirted around a lot of the very real problems of making sure we have inclusion, making sure that we have the right protections in place, and making sure that the whole environment is such that the clear opportunities that we've seen accelerated under the pandemic can be properly exploited. So I think this is clearly a conversation that has to continue. It's so rich, it involves every aspect of our lives, but I'd like to thank you all, Jacqueline, Taavi, Andrew, for really a very interesting, insightful conversation around this set of topics. I think it's been fascinating. Thank you very much, and we hope to catch up again in future and see how things develop. Thank you.